Hey, we're continuing on what kinds of fun things the STERP team found out about the Shroud. The seventh thing that I want to talk about is there were 3D qualities. Some of these scientists and the STERP team were from NASA. Uh, they took time off from their projects with the Gemini project and came and did this study. And they brought with them all kinds of the latest equipment, like the VP8 image analyzer. What it's used for with NASA is to take 2D images and make them 3D based on light and intensity and all that stuff. Again, I'm not a scientist here, but when they put a 2D image under the VP8 image analyzer, they've they discovered, to make a long story short, that um, it was a 3D was made as a 3D image. If you just take a regular picture, photograph, and you put it under the VP8, it will be all distorted. But when you take a picture of the shroud, which should be distorted, it ends up not being. So what this means for us is that the shroud wasn't done by a forger, just laid out on a table and drawn or done whatever to. It was made while it was on the body of a person. It was on that 3D image. So it was draped over a human form. And at that point, the image was made, which would have been very unique. And again, nothing a forger would know to have to do. Also, really, really fascinating is the pollen evidence. So they found all kinds of pollen on the shroud. And pollen grains are unique to each plant. Each plant has their own, kind of like a snowflake, has their own pollen grain. And so you could go ahead and figure out, based on some pollen, again, this is going to require a microscope. They were able to take samples of pollen from the shroud and determine what plants were on them. And what they did was they found that there were like 58 images, flower images, and pollen on the shroud. And one of the leading botanists in all of Israel, Avinoam Danin, did a huge study where he found some of the rarest pollen, like Zigdophilium domosum, which is very rare and only found outside of Jerusalem. So what that told Dr. Danin is that at some point, the Shroud of Turin did spend some time in the Holy Land because it would have had to pick up pollen from those plants. He also discovered that the highest density of pollen grains on the shroud are around the head, and he found that these pollen grains were from a plant called Gundelia tunaforti, which is has pretty flowers, but it's known for something a lot worse. It's a spiny plant, as you can see down there, with these thorn parts to them. And this would have been the plants that might have been used for a crown if this were in fact the crown of Jesus. Again, pollen that a forger would have had to created the shroud, gone in a boat, and rowed to or went to the Holy Land, rubbed it on some plants, assuming that their microscope would be invented, assuming that pollen would be found to be a thing. you know, of course that's not the case. So this really does eliminate the forgery theory. We also found that pollen was exclusive to certain parts that seemed to chart where the shroud had been. There's pollen from the desert plants of the Palestinian area. There's also plants from the zone up by where Edessa was. And then there are some plants from the Istanbulian environment when it was there. So the pollen kind of follows where the shroud, or at least the cloth of Edessa was. That matches up. Also, if that isn't enough, how about geological proof? So under a high res microscope, scientists found traver- travertine aragonite limestone particles embedded in the shroud's surface. This limestone, again, the shroud would have had to have been in touch, had been in contact with this particular type of limestone. The problem is that this limestone is very rare and found only in one place in the world, and that's a small area outside of, guess what? Jerusalem. So this means that the shroud would have had to have spent some time there in the Holy Land between the pollen and the limestone. The STURP team also found dirt on the nose, left knee, and heel. And this was they analyzed this dirt and they found that it was a rare calcium carbonate and matches samples taken from Jerusalem. So again, the dirt that seems to have come off the body onto the shroud matches Jerusalem's rare calcium carbonate. The evidence is pretty stacking up very significantly. Also, just a couple things here. What's interesting is that there are a number of different markings of facial peculiarities on the shroud that match with the depictions of Christ throughout history. It is really interesting because we look at a picture and right away we like, oh, that's Jesus, right? But how do we know that? There is no description, no physical description of Jesus in the Bible at all. And yet, when we look at all of these images, a Paul Vignon, a French researcher in the 1930s, did a study on the face of Jesus. And he noticed certain peculiarities that all match up. And when you match them all up, you'll also notice that they match the shroud. So this transverse streak across the forehead, it's three-sided square between the brow, kind of a raised right eyebrow, an accentuated left cheek, uh, long, elongated nose, owl-like eyes, and oftentimes two strands of hair coming from the middle of the part. So these are all, with all of his research, he discovered this. And if you look, see some of these ancient pictures, and you see the shroud, and you see this is all of these markings: the wisps of hair, the elongated nose, the owl-like eyes, just to name a few. You also have here, if you take, and here's a picture of the shroud matching up quite similarly. And here is a coin of Jesus. It says Jesus Christ, King of Kings, that was minted in the 4th century. And so there's no question of who it is. And if you take a picture like this of the Shroud of Turin and kind of put it over over the picture of the coin, and you kind of fade out of the images, you'll notice so many peculiarities that are the same. So much of what we go back to with the images of Jesus throughout history go right back to the shroud. So it is pretty clear that people throughout history thought that the shroud was legit as they used that for the images. So the last thing here before we finish up this is the Sudarium of Oviedo. This was first mentioned in Jerusalem in 570. It's the face cloth. It's um, and this particular cloth is now in Spain, in Oviedo, Spain, and its history is you can follow it from moving through North Africa, moving away from the Moorish invasion until it made it into Spain, where its reference in 1075 is legit, where it said, "This is the Sudarium of our Lord Jesus Christ." This is the face cloth which matches the wounds and the blood type on the shroud. There's no image on the Sudarium because it would not have been in contact with the body. It was hastily folded up kind of in a ball and made as a thick pad. And that's why there's so much blood on this. And there are even some of the same pollen grains.